Welcome again to the Thinc Conversation series, where we explore issues shaping South Africa. I'm Mathebula from the Thinc Foundation. I am in conversations with South Africans about how leadership can improve in our country. This is more than a conversation. It is a thought-provoking dialogue for a nation moving beyond transformation and transition. This edition focuses on the Beyond G20 Summit. The axiom for today is that great nations must implement what they have committed themselves to. Joining me to unpack this is former President Nelson Mandela's head of state protocol, Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, the ambassador. That's how I call him. We know that G20 summit came, it happened, heads of states were here, over 150 high-level meetings were held since January. What is next for South Africa and the African continent in particular?
Prof, maybe before we go there, if you may indulge me,
yes,
is to explain some of the underlying terminologies that I use when talking about the G20. To allow the viewer to follow up later on when we get into details about the discussion. One thing the founders of the G20 envisaged was to form a collegial group based on consensus decision-making. Now, you'd hear a lot of buzzwords called consensus, but I just want to explain what consensus means. Consensus, in theory, means a synthesis of everyone's ideas. It also means this synthesis of everyone's idea must be incorporated in the best possible way. And consensus, it's a group decision-making away from a vote, meaning that if you have one member who does not agree with whatever the group is saying, you're unlikely to reach consensus. And that's called, that's why South Africa spoke about this, sufficient consensus. What does sufficient consensus mean? It's sometimes referred as qualified consensus. It simply means that if there are one or two or so on members who don't agree with the agreement, or we don't agree with whatever is being negotiated, but they consent that this should pass, they can't use their disagreement to obstruct this from being adopted. So that is consensus. Now, how do you start reaching consensus? It's like putting, if you have 20 members, you tell them, put 3 issues that are important to you in the basket with the hope that you're going to get 1. 3 that you want, not that you don't want, with the hope that you're going to get 1. Once you've done that, you then go and look into what is in the basket. If A and B have contradictory issues, you allow A and B to sort out those contradictions and they reach consensus. You may not end up with the best option that you wanted in the agreement or in whatever you are deciding, but at least you'd end up with something and you'd accommodate others. There's another form of consensus that is called a lukewarm consensus. Lukewarm consensus, Prof, is when the majority agree that the minority's decision can go through and that they are not going to use their big numbers to obstruct the minority's agreement to go through. And that's essentially what it's meant by consensus. But it highlights one critical issue that I always call the power of one. If you are one, you can allow the majority not to override you. The majority must accommodate you. And I think when they were forming G20, they understood that you have some of the most powerful economies, most powerful countries, that if you were to use power to let them get away with what they want, the smaller ones, I mean, South Africa in the G20 is the smallest in terms of the GDP. And most of these countries are in their trillion-dollar GDP. South Africa is still on 419, the very smallest. So
although there's an argument that South Africa has a big wealth of soft power than most of them. You'll talk to me about that later.
Well, we're talking about how they
GDP.
envisage the formation, that if you were to allow the pocket to determine anything that you want to get, you are likely to run into problems.
Okay.
In our lingua franca, we would call you moreki, meaning that when we are at a nice place, you buy, so you call the shots. So this is no longer the situation where those who have the money call the piper. So there's an agreement. And I think it was couched along this way to deal with the question of this multilateralism that is emerging. Move away from a single decision or a single group or the tyranny of the majority to determine the agenda for all of us.
Or the tyranny of big economies.
The tyranny of big economies too, Prof. That's what was envisaged. And that's what needs to be harnessed. You will realize during the discussion this weekend at NASDAQ, the focus was around a consensus leaders declaration. It was to maintain that tradition. There was a view that if there's no consensus, the chair, which is South Africa, could issue out a statement, mapping out what was discussed and where there's agreement or where there's consensus or where there were no consensus. But that could be done by one country. Argentina had serious observation, and I listened to the statement of the Minister of Argentina, speaking also of the red line. But Argentina agreed that for the purpose of progress, they're not going to obstruct consensus. So they consented to the agreement with reservations that they have, however serious they may be. So that's how consensus works, and that's how it must be protected. You will see the narrative going around saying that Argentina did not consent. My understanding is that Argentina consented. If Argentina did not consent to that, this statement that was issued out as a consensus statement will be a fuss and will raise serious credibility problems. I don't think that's the case. Countries would have raised this, but you're dealing with the question of fake news and everything that's tried to project. My understanding is that Argentina signed on this.
But Dr. Makhubela, let's go back to what does this G20 actually mean for South Africans and the African continent in particular, based on the established consensus, the declaration and all those things. What are the things that you can tease out and say these things, they mean this to South Africa? From
Prof, it means more than what a lot of people are talking about. The first time on the South African soil, the first time on the African continent. It's beyond that. It's substantive. That's what we like to tease out and interrogate. If you look at the wording referring to Africa throughout this 30-page consensus agreement, it speaks about the African continent and beneficiation, the mineral resources and beneficiation that will create jobs. It speaks about the industrialization of the African continent. It speaks about the transfer of technology and artificial intelligence to allow the African continent to catch up. It essentially speaks about issues that are contained in the fourth industrial revolution. As you know, we're all lagging out behind about those issues. So that's so fundamental. It speaks about food security. Even yet, food security is a much broader problem that includes everyone around the world. I mean, if you look at the report, about 700 and something million people around the world are going without food every day. In Africa, they are saying you have about 200 million people who are going to bed without food. So those are the challenges that are coming out that have been identified. The big task now, Prof, that began yesterday is for South Africa to start synthesizing key issues out of this and start to prioritize them for follow-up and implementation. We can't have conferences without a review of the implementation of the previous one. So there's a need to do that. What was achieved here again on a broader scale, which came from Brazil? Brazil established the social component.
Maybe before we go there, I would like us to reflect on the Africa Free Trade Agreement and how has this G20 declaration enhanced the implementation of inter-Africa trade and our ability to advance on that thing, because that treaty was supposed to be one of the best treaties in the continent that would have made things like G20 to be easily implemented. Can you reflect on that, Ambassador?
Okay. You know, Prof, the Free Africa Trade Agreement has been ratified by the majority of members within the continent. So it's in effect as we are talking. But the hamstring that is related to the Africa Free Trade Agreement, it's around the systemic issues that have been a challenge. That's why if you go back to the Constitutive Act of the African Union, that speaks about the REC, the regional economic blocks, that must form the building blocks for the implementation. For the very first time, in terms of this G20, there's an emphasis on regional groups. Now, if you speak about regional groups in the context of Africa, you need to go back to the drawing line, speak about the SADC, ECOWAS, East African Community. These are the building blocks that were meant to facilitate free trade and easy movement of goods and services across the continent. But that's still a biggest challenge in terms of the implementation. And now the office has been set up to deal with a free trade based in Accra, Ghana. It's dealing with the systematic unblocking of some of the hurdles that most of them have their roots in the weakness of the African state, which is basically mirrored on a colonial state, was meant to be an extractive state.
But how are those systemic challenges making the G20 declaration hollow? But before you answer me, let me go and pay my bills. And we will be back with more on the Thinc Conversations.